Hello, Year 12 students. Welcome to the 8th video in this Station 11 series by Emily St. John Mandel. We're going to focus in on Section 8, The Prophet, and it starts at page 283, Chapter 48, which is set back in the timeline 20 years post-pandemic, and it's when Kirsten and August have been separated 3 days, and we begin with their timeline. So they have a bad dream. Kirsten has a bad dream, foreshadowing perhaps the confrontation that's about to begin with the prophet. So she awakes abruptly with tears in her eyes, and she dreamt she'd been walking and turned around, and then he was gone and she knew he was dead. And he says, "I have bad dreams too," holding his silver Starship Enterprise in his hand. Notice that there is a symbolic grasping for comfort as he holds on to this item of significance for him. I also just said notice the descriptions of nature. And one thing that you'll notice a theme throughout the novel is that prevalence of nature and the descriptions of the natural world and the beauty of the natural world, and the fact that the nature is surviving despite the apocalypse, and the fact that the people have mostly disappeared off the face of the earth. There is a pearl sky and the first pink of sunrise that's rippling. And you'll notice, just amidst the harshness of the new world, this beauty and majesty of nature that exists throughout. And they're walking away. They abandoned the suitcase because the wheels were too loud on the pavement, and they're walking and they see the aeroplane, which indicates that Severn City is close. They are ready. They've got weapons in their hands, and again, imagery of birds moving in and out of broken windows, perched on sagging utility wires. The imagery of the life and the birds and the old world, the sagging utility wires, useless items juxtaposed together. They think they might hear a dog bark, which would indicate the prophet, because the prophet, don't forget the prophet's dog, and they find Saeed appears on the road. He's gaunt, dirty, clothes were filthy and torn. He has several days' beard on his face, and there's two men and a boy who are following a few paces behind him. The boy is carrying a machete, and one of the men is carrying a sawed-off shotgun. And so Kirsten and August prepare. August is like, "I've got the gunman." Kirsten's, you get the archer. And so they attack. Kirsten and August attack, and Saeed kneels on the road, his head in his hands, and Kirsten runs to him. Don't forget that Kirsten and Saeed were lovers, and she's deeply emotional. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry they hurt you." Like, "Where's the dog?" "Well, the prophet's behind us with the dog," Saeed whispers. "He's got 2 men with him." They split up to take different roads. The archer, the guy that Kirsten has thrown the knife at, is still alive, and he is lying on his back. And this guy had been in the audience when they performed A Midsummer Night's Dream in St. Deborah by the water. "Why did you take Saeed?" she asked him. "Where are the other 2? "Well, you took something that belonged to us. We were going to do a trade." "Huh? What are you talking about? We took nothing." The girl says Saeed. He's talking about the stowaway. Remember Eleanor? That scared little kid. The archer refers to her as the 5th bride. And I noticed that they don't actually refer to her by name. which really emphasizes that sense of her being property and not having an identity unto herself, but just as belonging, dehumanizing her, but that she belongs to the prophet. It's the same modus operandi, it's the same mode of operation as with the town in Virginia that we read about in the last section with Jeevan. They're going to swap Eleanor for Saeed and the clarinet, and Deita, those three that were taken. So even though she's 12 years old, she's the property of the prophet. And I just noticed that Mandel's stern warning against how people can be manipulated. We see the archer who asserts the virus was the angel, our names are recorded in the book of life. Like he is a true believer, is the phrase they use later. Like he's really been brainwashed. So Mandel's warning against protecting oneself from the brainwashing and the strange ideologies that exist in the world that we need to arm ourselves against, perhaps. And the archer actually quotes from the book of Revelations, and behold, there was a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and old earth had passed away. And Kirsten takes her knife from his chest, and he dies 3, she thinks, obviously her 3rd kill, and she feels immensely tired. And that tiredness perhaps indicates that she carries the weight of these deaths, and that's going to come a bit later too. So Saeed then tells the story about how he gets taken. They press a chemical in a rag over their face, and then he passes out. But Deita didn't wake up. He must have had a reaction to the chemical, and Saeed watched him die, getting paler and paler, lips turning blue, and then not waking up. His breathing stopped, and Saeed watched it happen. So Deita dies as a result of the cruelty of this new world, and it really does emphasize the fact that the prophet and his followers don't see the value in human life. Deita dies, and so they return a few hours later with the clarinet. They just replace Deita with another hostage. One is exchangeable with another. So the clarinet, the person, clarinet player, is there to replace Deita. Chapter 49. And there's this cute little chapter in here about the clarinet, narrated from the perspective of the clarinet, and how she hates Shakespeare, which is a really cool perspective given that there's so much of this about Shakespeare loving, but there are alternative perspectives, and she loves the music of the symphony, but she finds the symphony's insistence on performing Shakespeare insufferable, and I think that word is good to learn. And she tries to keep the opinion to herself, and occasionally she succeeds. And she was arguing with she'd been thinking about writing her own play, and she was arguing with Deita that survival might be insufficient, but so was Shakespeare. So her argument is Shakespeare is insufficient. She wants to write something modern, something that addresses this age in which they've somehow landed. Maybe that idea that art should reflect our lives and experiences and come out of what's happening for us. And so she wants to write something to reflect that. And Deita says his usual argument of Shakespeare lived in a plague-ridden society with no electricity, and so does the Travelling Symphony. But she says, well, the difference is we've seen electricity. We've seen everything. We've watched a civilization collapse, and Shakespeare never did that. So they kind of acknowledge the parallels with Shakespeare and the Travelling Symphony, and they're both experiencing plagues and a plague-ridden society, but they are clearly 2 different circumstances. She isn't saying that she can do better, but she just says that the repertoire is inadequate. It's not enough. And so she begins writing this play. And she has one line: "Dear friends, I find myself immeasurably weary and have gone to rest in the forest," which is all she writes. And that happens to be the suicide note that they think that they find, that the Travelling Symphony thinks that they find much earlier on in the narrative. So that was written a year ago, And it was simply the opening line of a play. And Deirdre happens to know this, but obviously Deirdre's taken with her. And so while they were reading, they find her note stuffed in the backpack. And while they're reading this, the clarinet just happened to be waking up in a clearing from an unnatural sleep. She felt poisoned. Her hands, imagine this, her hands are tied behind her back. Her ankles are bound, and she's been taken. She can hear Saeed's voice, so she knows that, excuse me, Saeed is there, and they tell her that they're trading the two of you for the bride. Again, and Eleanor remains nameless, just simply known as the bride, revealing their dehumanization of her, the sense of possession. And there's a conversation with Saeed and the Prophet, and the Prophet asserts that this suffering is part of a greater plan. And Mandel just continues to criticize this view that there is some sort of a great plan that the human suffering is caused by. And the boy apologizes. We're sorry about your friend. He's quite apologetic. Later, this is the boy who actually kills the Prophet. Spoiler alert, just in case you haven't read it. Anyway, there's a criticism or a caution that I think Mandel is giving against acting like sheep here. The Prophet says, the fallen walk amongst us, we must be the light, we are the light. And the other four repeated in murmured unison, we are the light. That they repeat back like sheep to him. They're mindlessly obedient. And then Saeed, the clarinet, hears Saeed talking to this boy with the machete. And they're talking about what happened in the South. And the boy says that he doesn't like to think about it. We did what we had to do. So there's this sense that not everyone agrees with the Prophet, but they did what they had to do to survive. The boy says that it hollows you out thinking about it, remembering what we did. It just guts me. I don't know how else to put it. So the feelings hollow him out, and he's gutted by remembering what they did. And then Saeed says, well, do you believe what he says, all of you? He says, well, Clancy's a true believer, and Steve too, probably most of the others. But if you're not a true believer, you're not going to admit it. But so there's a sense that they're not all true believers. Some of them are just surviving, like the younger gunman. So there's a few of them. And the boy says, what choice do I have? I know it's not right, he says. I'm not saying it's right. I know it's not right. But what choice do I have? This time we live in, it forces a people to do things. And I think that brings us really interesting ethical question, is that we've talked about this idea that evil flourishes if good men do nothing, and the moral responsibility that people have to stand up. But then on the other side is in order to survive and to preserve one's life, there are sometimes times where I guess one's morals may be compromised. So this kid is too young to remember any different. Remember that there's been descriptions of, I guess, a calmness over the last decade, 10 years. But we also see by how cruel the Prophet is, that once you're in his grip, that it might be very difficult to escape. He says how sharp the training is. We move silently, we attack from behind. We can act silently, pick you off one by one. I've been training since I was 5. He was captured at 5, perhaps. You've got weapons, but you don't have skills. And Said questions this philosophy. You say you're being the light. How do you bring the light if you are the light? Basically, he's trying to keep him talking, this kid talking, to allow the clarinet to escape. She is one of the symphony's best hunters. She survived alone in the forest for 3 years after the collapse, and she vanishes noiselessly behind the trees, even though that she's still got the poison, the chemical in her. She flees, and she's walking and stumbling, dragging through the dragging hours, hallucinating, dreaming of water. And she warns the symphony. She delivers her message. You must change the route they are on to you. Notice the chaos through the repetition of the gerund forms of the verbs there. And she slips in and out of consciousness. So that's the explanation of why Kirsten and August couldn't find the symphony anywhere while they were going fishing, and how they became separated. There's a bit of a backstory there. And we'll continue with chapter 50. It's a section where the knife tattoos on Kirsten's wrists are explained. So the first one happened when she was 15 years old. She was attacked and he moved, never spoke a word, but she knew what he intended to do. And she then was soundless and calm afterwards when she pulled her knife from the man's throat and cleaned it. And she couldn't remember. There's nothing in her memories to account for how calm she is. And this is why she stopped trying to remember her lost year on the road. My argument is that it suggests that she saw or did much worse than this during that time, those 13 unremembered months that she's blocked out. And the second knife was 2 years later. Obviously she was 17, where there was 4 men, 2 with guns, 2 with machetes, who tried to rob the symphony. They say, give us what we want and no one has to die. And the symphony defend themselves. And she kills one of them as a result of that. And then they go on to perform Romeo and Juliet. Notice those juxtapositions of art and violence again. She hoped there would never be a third, but the archer is her third. She looks at August's face and she realizes that that gunman was his first kill. He had the colossal good fortune to have made it to year 20 without killing anyone. And if she wasn't so tired, she would have actually told him that she knew it is possible to survive this, but not unaltered. You'll carry these men with you through the nights of your life. And that idea that the things that you have to do to survive don't, like they exist, but they change you, and you carry the guilt, and the impact on your conscience will remain. And so, yes, they've knocked out the first set of men, but the prophet still exists. And there's this great section here at the bottom where we are of 296. There's a great section of the beauty amidst the horror. There's beauty in the decrepitude. The narrator says, there's sunlight catching in the flowers that have sprung up through the gravel of long overgrown driveways, mossy front porches turned brilliant green with blossoming bush alive with butterflies. Yeah, so life and spring and beauty. This world is dazzling, it says. And then there's pandemic images. Cars clogged, exoskeletons on flash tires, and trash from the old world. A real dichotomy, juxtaposition of the objects from beauty and the old world too. And that idea of conscience is repeated at the bottom of 297, where Kirsten, she said she once met a man who swore that the murdered followed the killers to the grave. And she was thinking of this. And the idea of dragging souls across the landscape like cans on a string. That idea of you can survive but not unaltered. And so they continue to walk towards the airport. And there's some imagery of death and hope. And they hear a distant bark of the dog, which lets them know the prophet is arriving, and they hide in the woods. The first thing they see, the long barrel of the prophet's rifle moving in and out of the shadow as he walked. And then that same boy who escaped this morning, the two men were killed, but the boy is there with the machete. He's carrying a handgun now, and the machete is strapped to his back. And then Luli sniffs her and looks directly at her through her. She's got a screen of leaves hiding herself. And "I see you," says the man with the crossbow. They tell her, stand up slowly, hands in the air. She's trying to think how to get out of this and strategize, but in the end, the best for survival, she drops her knife and steps forward. And the boy who is there looks stricken. So you can see how conflicted he is. Kirsten realizes that this is the end for her, probably actually the ending after a lifetime of near misses. And she thinks about the radiant world. Interesting, just before we had dazzling world, the radiant world, the sunlight and shadow and green. She's trying to think maybe to do something heroic, and the prophet recognizes her as Titania from the performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Then she asks his name, and he refuses. He says sometimes names are an encumbrance. I'd love to analyze that one too, but no time. Maybe pick it at another time. And the prophet begins a conversation with Kirsten. He says he's wandered all his life through this tarnished world, seeing such darkness, such shadows and horrors. I think it's a quote from Station 11. Later on, we see it in italics. Then Kirsten is ready to die. She is noticing the beauty around her, the leaves flickering in the sunlight, the brilliant blue of the sky. She wants that to be the last thing she looks at, not the prophet. She's thinking of conveying a message to August, the love that she has in this last moment. And this world is an ocean of darkness, says the prophet. This boy who was stricken, he's crying. He's now got a wet face. The prophet says, you think you kneel before a man, but you kneel before the sunrise. We are the light moving over the surface of the waters, over the darkness of the undersea. The undersea, she whispers. And a look of perfect serenity comes over his face. And there's this moment of connection. Both of them are quoting from the undersea, and they're talking to each other. Kirsten says, we long only to go home, from the first issue of Station 11, during a face-off between Dr. 11 and the adversary from the undersea. Remembering the adversary from the undersea being representing the prophet. Dr. 11, Miranda initially wrote her as herself, but now it's representing Kirsten. Kirsten says, we dream of sunlight, we dream of walking on earth. We've been lost for so long. We long only for the world we were born into, but it's too late for that, the prophet said. So they're actually quoting to each other from the Station 11 comic. And then there is a shot. She feels the sound, but she is not dead. The boy was in motion. It came not from the prophet's rifle, but the boy had shot the prophet in the head. And then August shoots some arrows through, and the boy shoots himself and ends his own life. And Kirsten is shocked, and the symphony arrives just at this moment. A bit of time later, they find a New Testament in the prophet's bag alongside a piece of paper, which is a page from the Dr. 11, Station 11 comics. And Dr. 11 kneels by the lifeless body of Captain Lonergan. which again represents Miranda, Kirsten, and Tyler the prophet, mirroring the prophet's dead body of Captain Lonergan's dead body. And now there's this line, you are his second in command, Dr. 11. In his absence, you must lead. Who is now the leader? Has Kirsten got to step up and lead now in this new world? Is that a symbolism somewhere? And Kirsten just wonders, how come you have this page? She's yearned for this, searched for this. I've walked all of my life through this tarnished world, which is again in italics, which previously has been done because of intertextuality, allusions to the comic books. After she worked with her brother out of Toronto, her brother had been plagued by nightmares. The road, he'd always said, I hope you never remember it. Now, the prophet's about her age. We know they're exactly the same age. Whatever else the prophet had become, he'd once been a boy, adrift on the road, and perhaps he'd had the misfortune of remembering everything. And so just this small moment, although we never get the narrative perspective of Tyler, we do get a sense of him being a victim of this world to some extent, that he wasn't born evil, but this evil is created by his experiences, his pain, by the nature, I guess, that he experiences. And this, the image of him lying dead, one of his arms is outstretched towards her. I just think that's a concept that she's hinting at anyway. Chapter 51. Now Kirsten has kind of adopted the prophet's dog, and they're moving closer towards the airport. Inside the terminal, there's a description of the tents, how all the people, there's 320 people living in the airport now, and in Charlie and Jeremy's tent, they greet her. She asks about a tattooist. She needs to have just one more, now 3. And there's this random section where Kirsten remembers the nursery. A few years ago, they were traveling in a country and they found a country house, and there's a flashback of a few years back where they had been in a nursery, and they find this tea set. I'm sure it's symbolic. I don't even know what it means. It's pretty creepy, to be honest. It's possibly indicating the possibility of ghosts. They like it, and so they want to take it with them. But in this dusty room, there's no dust on the tea sets, but there's no footprints. So there's only the footprints, hers and Charlie. And like in the midst of all of the mess, this tea set is set up perfectly. And it's just spooky. Honestly, I think it's hinting at ghosts, the reality of ghosts, but there's nothing ever mentioned. It's just an aside. Charlie calls it a strange moment and nothing more. A strange moment in a lifetime of moments. Are you asking if I believe in ghosts? I don't know, maybe, yes. Well, of course not. Imagine how many there would be. Yes, that's exactly it. So that idea of ghosts, if ghosts did exist, how many ghosts would exist after 99% of the people have been wiped out, perhaps? There's memories that she has. She particularly goes into her thoughts and remembers Deata and her grief over Deata. She remembers the conversation about Shakespeare and his plague-haunted life, and how his identity has been shaped by his experience with the plague. And that sense of Mandel is concerned about how we form our identity. I think an identity as a theme is worth looking at there. And then Kirsten meets Clark and has a beginning conversation with Clark. Clark is shaved all his hair off. He's got 4 loops in his left earlobe and has a silk neck scarf tied in a complicated knot. I just have this image of like an old punk rocker. But apparently, Clark, if you look on page 311, they do talk about the interview, but they don't go further into it. But the main focus here, page 311, a week ago, appeared the most extraordinary thing through the telescope. I don't know how they did it. What? Can we borrow the telescope? James said. Just have a look through. And Kirsten, so they walk up to the telescope, and in the distance, pinpricks of light arranged into a grid. There, plainly visible on the side of a hill, miles distant, a town or a village whose streets were lit up with electricity. And I think this really definitely represents hope. And some may argue that the timing of this after the prophet's death indicates that in the absence of this extreme theology, there can be progress. I'm not certain or completely convinced. I definitely think that it represents hope, and not necessarily because electricity in itself is the beginning of all that's important in the world, but more that just the fact that it's possible, that they gathered together and do this extraordinary thing that is so difficult. I think that's worth mulling on. I don't think electricity is the focus here. It's the fact